Hey, it's James from Marketing for Restaurants here, and welcome to episode 57 of Secret Sauce, the restaurant marketing podcast, Mental Illness in the Restaurant Industry.
Some restaurants are quiet, lose money, and the owner works 70 hours a week. Other restaurants are busy, profitable, and the owners work a few hours a day. What's the difference? They have a secret sauce. Join James from Marketing for Restaurants as he helps you come up with your recipe for restaurant success. Your secret sauce.
Hey everyone, today's podcast is going to be a little bit different to what we normally do. We're not going to be talking about Facebook marketing. We're not going to be talking about building awesome websites or building your database. We're going to be talking about mental illness, and we're going to talk about mental illness for a couple of reasons. One, it's a conversation that I think needs to be had a lot more often in the restaurant industry. There is an incredible amount of stress for everyone working in the restaurant industry, and I think that this, compounded with the fairly high incidence of mental illness throughout the general population, can mean that people can really exacerbate the effects of mental illness for people who are working in the restaurant industry. I want to talk about it because it sort of aligns with our BHAG, our big, hairy, audacious goal, which is to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Now, for us, that means that, we want to help restaurant owners to fulfill their dream, to have the restaurant that they had when, the dream that they had when they started their restaurant. And because it is so tough, because profitability is such an issue, the hours are long, there's an incredible amount of stress. A lot of people have forgotten what that dream was, and the pressure really does get to some people. And this was really brought home to me a few years ago now. I was going through some data for work, being a data analytics company. On a Saturday night, I was sitting on the couch while my wife was watching TV, and I was going through some data from some of our customers, looking at, what works and what doesn't. And I noticed that one of our customers was getting some traffic from a website that I hadn't heard of before. And I had a look, and it was one of those referral sites. And I emailed them, for a little bit of information. This is at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. And someone emailed me back, and I emailed him and said, "You must be the owner." And he said, "Yeah, I am." And he goes, "How did you find out about us?" And I said, "Oh, we have a mutual customer." And I mentioned the restaurant. And he goes, "Oh, yeah." And he said, "They're dead, don't you?" Well, he emailed back, "They're dead." And I was like, "No." And what had happened was, it was a husband and wife team, which is so common in restaurants, both working to fulfill their goal. And the pressure and stress of running their restaurant had gotten so much that they both committed suicide. They left two grown-up children, their business partner, and to me, it was a really big shock. I'd known that there'd been some profitability struggles. I know that there'd been some issues with reviews, fake reviews, and really, really quite scathing reviews, which was really, it was really quite distressing. I'd eaten at the restaurant. I'd met the owner. It was a great restaurant, and he did a great job. The chef out the back did a great job. I thought, they provided a really good experience for what they were trying to achieve. You read some of the reviews that were there, and it was like, you would never say that to someone's face. Why would you write that review? Now, I don't know what it was that pushed them over. There were difficulties in running it, and there was probably staffing issues, I guess, because that seems to be a permanent issue in the restaurant industry for a lot of people. Fake reviews or scathing reviews, which are really quite unfounded. These are the kind of pressures that people face, and I think when you look at how hard the restaurant industry is, then you layer they say that 1/3 of people are going to have an experience with mental illness in their life. Put those two things together, and it really is really can make for some difficult and bleak situations for some people. So I want to have this conversation so that hopefully we can destigmatize this a bit. But lastly, and I think the most important reason that we're doing this podcast, is that we've got a really courageous chef who's prepared to share his journey as a chef and how it has been accompanied with his journey with mental illness. And I think it's a really important story to be told. Today we're going to be talking to Chef Shaun Quade from Restaurant Lume. He talks about his battles with mental illness, the therapy that he has found within being a chef and how that has helped him, how he dealt with the interpersonal relationships in working in a lot of very high-stress kitchens that he's worked in. But also one of the things that I find really fascinating is his approach to mental illness and the other side of mental illness, which you hear sometimes people talk about it, but it happens so rarely. And this is the little spark that has helped Chef Quade get to where he is. So let's get into it. Let's have a listen to what Chef Quade's got to say about his journey with mental illness. So welcome to the show, Shaun.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, James.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are and your story?
I am the chef owner of Lume Restaurant in South Melbourne, Australia. We've been open for approximately 2 years now, just a little bit over 2 years. We're kind of known for doing contemporary style, a tasting menu using native ingredients and using a lot of different techniques and kind of innovating techniques as well. So that's a bit of a background on the restaurant. And myself, I've been a chef since 2001. I grew up in Toowoomba in Queensland and moved out of there. I moved to Key. I worked at Key for a little while and I moved down to Melbourne. I worked at the Royal Mail Hotel with Dan Hunter for a couple of years. I moved back to Sydney to work with James Files at Biota when he was opening there. So that was another 2 years and lots of little different things in between. A little bit of consulting work, a little bit of just pure pastry work, patisserie and baking and all that sort of thing. And yeah, that kind of all led me on the path to opening Lume in 2015.
Which has gone really well. It's got a reputation as being one of the most innovative restaurants in the country.
Yeah, which I think, we've worked quite hard for it. And that's really interesting to me that, we've built up that reputation and perspective is a big thing for me. So I think, what do people think when they hear the word Lume or someone tells them about them? And that's one of the key words that I want them to think is innovation and, things along those lines. So that's really nice.
So what is your relationship then with mental health?
My relationship, so we've had a bit of a rocky past. When I was in my late teens, I wasn't doing so well and basically went to the doctor and, he, I guess, growing up in Toowoomba, there's not a huge kind of network of psychiatrists and therapists that there is in major cities. So I just went to my GP and he diagnosed me with depression and gave me Zoloft, which is a antidepressant, and didn't really tell me much about it. I kind of did my own research, but as we all know, like Google, you can find pretty much anything for both sides of the argument. So that wasn't very helpful. And yeah, I started taking Zoloft and it didn't really work. It wasn't the right thing for me to take. So I just stopped taking it. And I kind of swore off going to doctors for that particular symptom. And pretty much throughout my 20s, I basically just struggled with depression, anxiety, OCD, which I didn't know really what they were at the time. But as you get older, you learn a few things and talk to different people. So it's been a constant thread in my life of just learning how to deal with mental health without really, in my 20s especially, doing anything about it, just, because no one really talks about it, especially in our industry. So it wasn't until I was 29, I think, or 30, that I kind of hit a pretty bad place and, I was not enjoying work. I just was really, really, really struggling, suicidal, all that sort of thing, just really, really not in a good place. And I forced myself to go and see a GP and he referred me to a psychiatrist and kind of started the ball rolling again and ended up being re-diagnosed with bipolar 2 and put onto some new medication, which was, again, not the right one for me. So I went through 3 different types of medication, just trying to find the right thing that fit my system and fit my mental makeup. And slowly but surely kind of dragged myself out of that grey wasteland that many people are familiar with. And, with the help of some people, I managed to get back on my feet, and that pretty much brings us to today. So actually, as of today, I'm not actually on any medication. I've decided to not take anymore because I've done a lot of work just figuring out how I work and how my head works and how I relate to people and all that sort of thing. So, today I feel as stronger than I ever have, since I was a little kid. So that's pretty much my relationship with mental health in a nutshell. So
it's interesting now that you're off medication. That's awesome. Mm. It sort of started before you were in the restaurant industry then, is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
And you've worked in a lot of high-end restaurants where there's a significant amount of pressure. How did that sort of play out as you were sort of trying to work out what it was that was going on in your head? How did you find working in the restaurant industry? Because it is a tough industry. There's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, there is a lot of pressure. I think the interesting thing with me in particular, I put a lot of pressure on myself to do well. So I think working in all these high-end kitchens where, you have other people putting pressure on you, and it was never as much pressure as I was putting on myself to achieve and do well. So that was kind of one way of dealing with it. And the other way of dealing with it was just immersing myself into my job. So that was my medication. And just in hindsight, it actually helped in a lot of ways. And an interesting point, I remember watching a BBC documentary where it was just a pretty general documentary on mental health, and they basically asked all the people that they were interviewing, if you had the choice, would you change your mental makeup? Would you just take all your mental health away? And every single one of them said no. So I found that quite interesting because it's such a horrible thing, but it does, I guess, like any interesting person you meet, they've often been through something that's, not great. They've had something happen to them. So it's kind of a way to, move on. It's that sink or swim mentality, fight or flight. You either just stop and shut down, or you get on with it. And I chose to get on with it and just immerse myself into the work and the kitchens and learning. So just being really obsessive about it. So that kept my head busy, and, it wasn't perfect. It's not a perfect solution, but I guess it worked for me. It's not to say that it would work for other people, but I guess that's how I got through a good pretty much 10 years of essentially no medication and just trying to figure things out for myself. So being in that kitchen environment where everything's very structured and routine driven was actually quite good. I guess, I've never been in the military, but just from talking to people, it's very similar in the way that, there's a hierarchy and there's routine, and every day you have to do the same thing, and there's precision and things expected of you every day. So, that was actually quite good for keeping me on the straight and narrow, so to speak. So that's how I dealt with it.
How long did it take from you, in your late 20s when you sort of hit rock bottom, how long did it take for you to sort of turn the ship around? How long were you working through that before you could start to see that, things were improving and that you were on the up and up?
It was a good couple of years. I'd say about 2.5 years from basically me just shutting down. I was actually working. I was doing a night shift. I was baking overnight by myself, just listening to music and podcasts. So I had no contact with anyone, which was it's a great situation to be in when you're in that mindset. So from going from that to actually being back on my feet and feeling like I could, really push myself again and I guess contribute to society. It's quite hard when you're in that mindset to think about anything else but yourself and, let alone hold down a stressful job or, have other people relying on you. So you can't even comprehend that sort of thing. You're just basically just getting through day to day and sleeping. It's like, what am I going to eat next? And just dealing with things minute to minute. So, and that's what it feels like. So yeah, it was a good 2.5 years to get back to some sort of normality and routine.
That's a long road, isn't it?
Yeah, it is long. And it's not easy as well. But it's impossible to explain in words sometimes just how, having depression and anxiety particularly just, it's really, really hard to explain to people what it feels like until you've actually experienced it. And some people can't deal with it and some people do. So I think more people would be able to deal with it if we actually talked about it more, because 1 in 3 people have a mental health disorder, but it's something that we never talk about, especially when it comes to your work colleagues. And in business, it's still seen as a sign of weakness. So I guess I can only go on my experiences, but I don't think I'd be as successful as I am today if I didn't have mental health issues. And that's the bottom line. So I'm not saying it's been easy, but that's just how it is. It's made me very driven, and I think I've managed to turn it on its head and actually use it as a positive thing, quite a powerful thing to kind of, drive myself and drive my career. So again, as I said before, it's not for everyone doing that sort of thing. I mean, that's what makes it such a difficult beast to deal with, because every single person has something unique to them. There's no set medications for people. There's no set treatment for people. It's such a long, drawn-out process sometimes to actually treat people. And again, just in my instance, the amount of medications that I've tried and gone through, and different therapists, so many therapists, because you have to be able to relate to them and talk to them and open up to them. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So it's a long, drawn-out process. But again, it's either sink or swim. You either go through it and do the work and commit yourself to it. Otherwise, you just can't go on. And I think the people who feel that they can't go on, if they had more support, if more people talked about it, and they felt like they could relate to other people that were going through something similar or exactly the same thing, that there would be a lot more people that would be much, much better off. So I think that brings us to today. It's something that people are starting to talk about, and there's a lot of great organizations around that do some amazing work. But in general, just in how we perceive it in general society, I mean, even in pop culture, TV shows and stuff, it's still seen as this, still has this horrible stigma around it. So all that has to change, because it's no different to someone having diabetes or something that is totally treatable, but it doesn't have this horrible stigma around it. Like, someone with diabetes would never be able to be a CEO. Well, that's horse shit. I mean, of course someone can do that. It just needs to be talked about. So it's 2017. I think we just need to get on with it and realize that it exists and stop sweeping under the rug, so to speak.
Well, I think that's a really good point. I was reading an article in the Fin Review last week, and there was a CEO, an ex-CEO, he's retired now, and he said now that he's retired, he feels that he can talk about his battle with depression because he had a duty to shareholders and the board, and he was sure that they would have perceived that he was unable to do his job, and he was quite successful in his job. Yeah. So
yeah, it's a really good point. I think, again, that statistic, 1 in 3 people, you just look at 3 of your work colleagues, how many different people work in an office or wherever, or getting back to hospitality, working in a restaurant. I mean, we have 15 staff. I mean, most restaurants would have, around 10 staff or 15 staff or even more. So how many of those people are struggling, and we just don't talk about it? It's something that you have to deal with by yourself. And that, to me, is just, it's insane. It's so outdated. It's such an outdated state of mind for society to be in. So, yeah, it needs to change.
What was the reaction to your peers when you were going through that dark period? So obviously it was highly risky for you because you were working nights and alone. Mm-hmm. What about the time when you were interacting with other people in the business? What was their perception of you? Did they know that you were in a dark place, or were you able to hide that from them?
Actually, no one knew at all. There's a very specific few people that have known throughout my career, just, people that I trust and have been close to and that I feel I can, talk to. But yeah, no one knew or anything like that. I think people get very adept at hiding things and acting, so to speak. I mean, it's even today, like I actually think I'm quite good at just, you just put on this persona, and I think people with a trained eye will be able to see the real story behind the mask. But, to the average person just day to day dealing with people, I can very, very easily come across just very normal and having a great time, having fun, just loving life, all that sort of thing, when sometimes it's far from the truth. So you do become very adept at putting on a mask and putting on a brave face or a happy face, so to speak. So the unfortunate thing is that it's not till something horrible happens, someone commits suicide or someone does something that's a direct cause from their mental health that they haven't dealt with properly. So, more often than not, it's when celebrities, Robin Williams, perfect example, one of the funniest people in the world, loved by everyone, pretty much universally, decided to take his own life because he must have been really struggling. And it's a guy with a family, he's got kids, and universally loved by everyone. And I think that's a perfect example of how fucking intense depression and anxiety in particular can be, because there's a guy that has had an amazing career, is loved by everyone, has money, has a family, has kids, but just couldn't handle being alive anymore. So it's something that, there's been so many articles written about him in particular because, he's such a funny guy, but people looking at, little signs throughout his career and just little signs in interviews where it's a mask. It's a way of projecting that everything's okay by, it's almost like playing an offensive game. You're going out there and putting on your best act, your best face, so to speak, and not letting anyone in. So, that's a very good example that everyone would know.
So what are some of the practices that you've seen in kitchens that you've worked in that exacerbate some of these issues?
Every kitchen's different, but kitchens in general, especially a decade ago or, even in the 80s and 90s, they're quite tough places. They're very, very stressful. There's a lot of pressure on you and not particularly supportive places either, not supportive environments. You may have been constantly yelled at or in some cases physically abused, and it's literally the worst situation you could be in if you're feeling quite mentally fragile. And I think, again, today a lot of that is changing. The days of the screamy chef, throwing pots and pans around the kitchen and kicking customers out of the restaurant because they asked for salt and all that sort of thing, that doesn't exist anymore. Those people are dinosaurs. And I think that's a good thing because it's just being smart about how you deal with pressure and how you deal with, the constant day-to-day critiquing, which is another quite interesting point that, is not exclusive to hospitality, but it's definitely something that people struggle to deal with, is the constant criticism, especially with everyone having access to a blog or to Zomato or TripAdvisor or all those different platforms. It's quite a unique industry because you're creating something. It's a creative industry. And it's quite a personal thing. For me, it's quite personal, creating something, and then people come in and they try out your creation and, the restaurant that you've created and, the dishes and all the stuff that you've put together. And then if they don't like it, well, there's immediate criticism that sometimes you can actually see immediately in the dining room. So you have to have a very thick skin to deal with that, which I think makes it quite a unique industry and something that's very susceptible to people looking for other ways to deal with stress and escape from reality, so to speak. So drugs and alcohol are absolutely rampant in the industry.
Which exacerbates mental illness.
Has knockoff drinks and just, Saturday night is, you just wipe yourself out. And again, it's something that's changing, but it's a long way to go.
I think you've touched on a really interesting point with the reviews, because now everyone feels empowered to leave their review as if they're a Michelin judge. And yet, sadly, 99.999% of the people who are leaving those reviews aren't Michelin judges, and 95% of them haven't even worked in a kitchen before, so they've got no idea. But it is one of the things that not many people are looking at, but what is the impact of these reviews? Because I know, so we had one customer who probably about 3 years ago now committed suicide, and the reviews were one of the components that I'd spoken to him probably about 4 or 6 weeks prior, and reviews were one of the things that he was like, how do you deal with this? Like, who writes this stuff? And I talked to him briefly about it and gave him some general, ways of managing online reviews. But it was only after I found out that he'd committed suicide that I went back and read every single one of them. And I just thought, who writes this shit? Like, who would really write this? Like, it was such a personal attack, and I'd been in his restaurant. It was a good restaurant. I felt bad reading it, and it wasn't even my restaurant. It would have been devastating, I reckon, to them to have read that about their restaurant. It is their piece of art that they're creating on a daily basis for a fickle audience. It's an incredibly tough thing, and I think this is one of the issues in the industry, as long as the pressure. So we've discussed some of the negative things, though. But so you're running one of Australia's most innovative restaurants. There's a couple of things that I've pulled out of your story. So one is the obsession, the need for, almost a need for perfection, and I guess it's not about perfection, but it's the journey towards perfection and getting as close as you possibly can.
Yeah.
That's one component of it then. But the other thing I think is really interesting is the creativity, because your mind is coming up with things that other people aren't coming up with. So there has to be something in that, doesn't there?
Yeah, I think so. I get asked all the time, it's like, where do you get your inspiration from? And, how do you do this? How do you do that? I mean, where does it all come from? It's a really hard question to answer, because I think everyone has a different journey that they take. Everyone's had a different upbringing. They've been born into different situations. They've had different experiences. And for me, what I do on a day-to-day basis is a culmination of pretty much everything that I've experienced from the day I was born. So that's the best way I can explain it. I think, just to break it down, like I'll be working on a dish or thinking about some component of what we do at the restaurant that I'd like to change or do something completely new. And there'll be memories and there'll be things that you draw from that, you experienced 10, 20 years ago that, had some sort of impact, whether you knew it at the time or not. They had an impact on you, and they're tucked away in your head. And that's the best way I can explain it. Everything in the restaurant in particular has gone through my head in some sort of process and come out, and I guess that's the style. It's, I feel quite lucky that people quite enjoy what we do here, because, all I've done is basically created something that I would like to go to. And not in a selfish way. It's just, I guess that's what people do. They do what they know. And again, it's a combination of all these different experiences, different restaurants that you've been to and different kitchens that you've worked in, people that you've talked to, seminars and music, and not just in hospitality, but different artists that you're inspired by and musicians and all that sort of thing. Like, they all have an impact on the creative side of how you work. So, and that to me is how I create something. It's just having a singular idea and kind of putting it into my head and kind of stewing over it and thinking about it, and just actually starting the process of just testing out one of the components. Or that's the biggest thing, is actually just taking that first step and just trying it out. Because it's not until you do that you realize that, this is going to be quite interesting. This could actually be something, or more often than not, you'll actually do something. It's like, that was total shit. So I would say 3/4 of the dishes on the menu at the moment started off as something completely different and have just kind of morphed into what they are today. And that's pretty much how I work. I mean, you'll have an idea and you try something out and you realize that it's not great, but then you'll notice something about it. It's like, what if I do this to it? And what if I take it in that direction? And it ends up becoming something completely different. But along the way, while you're thinking about that, is how innovation happens and new things come about, because you're applying your experiences and your memories, your things that have happened to you in the past, you're applying that to what you're doing today, right now. And I think that's how I work. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, the thing I think that process is the innovation process is really quite interesting. But I think the really big question is, what is it that's going on in your head that's different to other people's heads? Because everyone's like, innovation is where it's at. If you can innovate more quickly and better and come up with better dishes, then you've got a significant competitive advantage. And a lot of people aren't doing that. So this is the thing. I think this is where the big question is what's going on in your head that's actually aiding that creative process. And I think it comes back to what you said before about all of those people with mental illness and saying, if you could not have it, would you do that? And them saying no, because it's part of what makes me me. I think there's probably a lot to that. And it's very similar in the IT world, in the developer world. A lot of companies now have started to prefer hiring people with Asperger's because they make extremely good coders. They're quite happy to code away for 8 hours straight. They've got long attention spans, very, very good attention to detail, and they're not distracted in the way that other developers are. So it really is about understanding the way that people work and the way that they think, and then really sort of creating an environment around them to flourish. What other thing do you think that chefs and managers can do better to be aware of mental health and the way that they run their teams?
I think it's like anything, you need to recognize that things change. Things are always going to change. They always have changed. There's nothing you can do about it, so you need to embrace it. Otherwise, you become irrelevant very, very quickly. Specific to our industry, there's so many restaurants just opening every single week at different levels. So you need to be competitive, and you need to have a game plan, and you need to be smart about how you deal with the day-to-day pressures of running a hospitality business. So you can't just say, I remember this is how we used to do it in the old days. I don't give a fuck about the old days. Who cares? You move on. You make allowances, and it's important to know where you've come from and where other people have come from. But you shouldn't dwell on that. You take the good points out of that and you move on, because otherwise, what's the point? You shouldn't be running your own business, because not just in hospitality, but everything changes every day. There's just constant change around us in 2017, and particularly technology-wise, every single day there's something coming out. So I think in hospitality in particular, there's a lot of conservatism, and I don't want to say backwards thinking, but just lots of people dwelling on how things have always been done, which drives me insane, because we have access to so much information and technology and support that we need to look for it and search for it, and not do things the way that we were taught how to do them. If I did things the way that I was taught how to do growing up in kitchens, well, then I'd have the same restaurant that I worked in 10, 15 years ago. You need to take, as I was saying, you need to take the good points from all these different situations that you've been in, and then apply them to the situation that you're in today. So,
well, I think the really big thing is that people's attitude towards mental illness has changed fundamentally. In the old days, you didn't need to manage mental illness because no one talked about it. It was generally accepted that no one was going to ever have that conversation. Yeah,
it's a good point, because as someone I have 15 staff that work for me at the moment, and I spend a lot of time just managing them, making sure that everything's okay and they have what they need, and they have the equipment that they need, and they have the support from the management that will help them do their job to the potential that they have. So it's just being smart about it and realizing that, everyone bitches about millennials and them being lazy and precious and all that sort of thing. And it's kind of hard to explain, because it's something that's been a constant throughout history, is that the new generation comes through and they've had a different experience growing up, and they've been born into different circumstances as their predecessors, as their parents, as their boss, as their mentor, whoever. And it's our job as people who are looking after them and supporting them in their part of the journey to actually recognize that that's the case, that they've had a different set of experiences, they've had a different set of, circumstances happen to them. And there's nothing you can do to change that. You need to embrace it and be smart about how to work with them and get the best out of them, because otherwise, again, you just become irrelevant and you'll become that stereotypical cranky old guy, that just bitches about how it was in the old days and kids don't know anything and they're always on their phones and all that sort of thing. And it's like, well, that's our reality. You either sink or swim. You either change or you don't, and you shut down. So I think specifically talking about mental health, it's something that everyone is affected by, whether they're directly or indirectly affected by it. So we need to talk about it and embrace it and figure out what we're going to do about it. Because it's a good point you said before about, IT companies hiring people with Asperger's. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, people like that would have been thrown into an asylum, or 100, 200, 300 years ago, they would have been left in a forest somewhere. So things have changed, and it's just being smart about how we deal with people on a day-to-day basis.
And I think this is the benefit of a team approach. You can we try and build a team so that we can minimise people's weaknesses and maximise everyone's strengths, because we're all in a war for talent and we need to be getting the best out of everyone that we can, because, it's hard to find good people these days.
It's very, very hard. It's a constant source of stress, is trying to build and maintain a team that can do what you want them to do. It's probably the main part of my job, being a restaurateur now, as opposed to just being a chef, a total game changer. You have to know how to manage people, and it's not something that you get taught either. Being a chef, you're not taught how to talk to people and deal with their problems and manage them to the best of your ability without destroying their confidence or harming them in some way. It's very easy just to yell at people when you're feeling frustrated, and we're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of it. I think every chef would say the same thing, but that's not how you get the best out of people. A lot of people say that they're very supportive of the industry and that they love the industry, but their actions don't reflect their words. They just use people, and I never wanted to have a business like that. I try to hire people that will bring something to the business and have their own opinions, and my end goal as being a manager is to actually be able to step back and just watch everyone doing their job. And it's like this little microcosm, this this little perfect storm that you've built. I don't want to be in there micromanaging people. I just want to be in the background, give them the skills that they need, give them autonomy, and let them do their job. I mean, of course, you have to hire the right people to do that, and you have to train them. But when it works and you've done it properly, it's amazing. It's really, really satisfying running a restaurant where everyone is a professional and everyone knows what's expected of them. Everyone knows what their job is, and they've been given the skills that they need to produce the work that they need to. And it's a beautiful thing. So again, back to my point, I think you just need to be smart about how we deal with people, and specifically with mental health. It's just recognizing that it does affect everyone. So we can't just continue to ignore it. And hospitality is such a great example, because it's a stressful job, it's a stressful industry, and there's access to a lot of things that exacerbate mental illness. So there's stress, there's drugs, you have very easy access to alcohol. So it's an industry that can be very, very rewarding for the right person, and that people that have their support and have worked in the right places. But it's also an industry where people can go into it and it can chew them up and spit them out within a year if they're not in the right kitchen, if they're not in the right restaurant, or if they've not had the right support from the people that they've worked with. So it's a very layered discussion. It's still a discussion that we need to have, and I think it's only when we kind of confront it head on and just acknowledge that, yeah, people have this, it goes on, what are we going to do about it? That's the only way that the industry is going to move forward.
And I think it's a really good point. In the right team, those people can do some pretty amazing things. And you've even then got your example where, creating one of the best restaurants in Australia, and probably not in spite of, but because of your mental health.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've been quite fortunate that I've had a few key people along the way that have helped me out and kind of pushed me, nudged me in the right direction. And my partner Veronica's hugely supportive of what I do and how I work, and it's something we openly talk about all the time, and it's an impossible thing to deal with if you don't have support. You feel like you're all alone, and that's the horrible thing about it. Is it brings me back to my point that I made about Robin Williams before, is that on the surface he's beloved by the entire world, has a huge amount of money, has been very, very successful, but that wasn't enough. And that's how it feels in your head. You feel like you're worthless, and that you just can't contribute, you can't do anything right, or you just feel like the world is like crushing you with pressure and crushing you with this, grey matter, so to speak. So it's something that can be absolutely crushing and, just horrible, and in some cases people can't deal with it. So recently we had a really, really well-known chef, a very popular chef, Jeremy Strode in Sydney. He decided to take his own life. And again, a very, very good example of someone who's been very, very successful and was absolutely loved by his peers. Everyone that ever met him or worked with him had nothing but nice things to say about him personally and about his work. Very successful throughout his career, had a family, has had kids. But again, it wasn't enough, and that's the horrible thing about it. So to lose someone like Jeremy, that's kind of spurred a lot of people to kind of talk about it more, and which is a great thing. But it's like what I was saying before, it kind of takes, when it happens to a celebrity or it happens to a really well-known figure, that's the only time that people talk about it, because it happens all the time. People die all the time. People commit suicide all the time. People are sick all the time. There's horrible shit that goes on in the world every single day, every single minute. But no one talks about it unless it happens to them, or it happens to someone that they love, or it happens to someone that they know. So it's a really tough thing. It's tough for people to talk about because it's had this stigma around it for so many years. And again, it's kind of drawing it back to what we were talking about before. It's almost innovating, because we're deciding to tackle something head on that has never, ever been popular discussion in society, ever. In the history of mankind, no one's ever really freely talked about it. So I think in 2017, across all industries, not just hospitality, people need to do that. I'm happy to talk about it openly. I mean, I'm not embarrassed by what I go through and what's happened to me in the past. It's just something that's happened, and it's a fact. It's like, I can look back at it now, and it's no different to me thinking about, oh yeah, I broke my leg when I was 13. That's how people should feel about it, that it's something that people experience, and that they shouldn't be ashamed about breaking their leg. They shouldn't be ashamed about having a mental health issue, because it's no different. It's something that happens to you. It's not your fault.
Exactly.
And that's the biggest thing. It's no one's fault that they've been dealt this card, dealt this hand. It's not like they've done something horrible and then been given this mental health card. It's people are born with it. They have predispositions to it. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people need to remember, is that it's not, people shouldn't be blamed for how they are. You could say that for a number of things, so many different things, but specifically with mental health, it's not their fault. So I think that's a good point.
Exactly, and I think that's why I'm so grateful for you for sharing your journey, because I think that a lot of people, hopefully it's inspirational to a lot of people who are suffering from mental illness. And on top of that, it'll be educational for those who aren't, but are working with people who are. It'll be just another step as we try and destigmatize something that has such a huge impact on society as a whole. So thank you very much for sharing your story today.
No, it's okay. My pleasure. I hope someone, even if it's just one person that listens to this, and they can relate to my story and realize that things can change. It may not feel like it now or at the time, or you might feel like nothing's ever going to change and the weight of the world is upon you, but things can change. It just takes time.
Exactly, yeah. So thank you very much.
Thanks, James.
So there it is. I think that it's a really powerful conversation, and I hope that there's a couple of people out there who listen to this and just get something out of it, whether you're dealing with mental illness and you can see that maybe there is the light at the end of the tunnel is a little bit brighter, Or if you've got people on your team who are dealing with mental illness, maybe you can start to think about some of the tactics that you can use to not only make the environment a little bit easier for them, but also how you might be able to actually harness some of the benefit that they may have. I think it's really fascinating when you look at that positive side of mental illness. If you haven't eaten at Restaurant Lume, you should definitely go there because the experience is really unlike anything else that I've had in any of other restaurants that I've eaten in. The quote that I really like about Restaurant Lume is by John Lethlean, who is one of Australia's most famous food writers, food critics. And he said that there are things going on in the kitchen at Restaurant Lume that aren't happening anywhere else in Australia and possibly even anywhere else in the world. Now, those things that are happening in the kitchen, they have come from the mind of Chef Quade. And the innovation, the creativity, I think is really incredible. And it's definitely worth exploring further. But you can see the linkage there between the mental illness and the thing that has made him such a talented and such a highly proclaimed chef. So it's a difficult topic to talk about, and I really thank Chef Quade for talking about it, showing the courage to have this conversation because of the issues that we have in the restaurant. As he says, something happens and everyone says it's a real shame that it's happened, but nothing actually changes. We really need to destigmatize this. We need to try and make the work environments as accommodating as possible to people, but also look at the other side of mental illness, the way that people's brains work. So thank you. I hope you got something out of it.
Want more customers for your restaurant, cafe or takeout? Every month, our marketing tools and information are used by thousands of restaurant owners just like you to help them find more customers and turn them into repeat customers. All of our tools and information is designed specifically for restaurant owners. We know you don't have a lot of time to spend marketing or learning complicated procedures, so our tools are quick and easy to use. If you're looking to increase your revenue and profits or want to work less hours, check out marketingforrestaurants.com.